When's the last time you vlogged?
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen and I'm doing a very rare thing on my channel, which is vlogging. I'm gonna attempt it. We'll see if it actually happens. But for this vlog, I wanted to give authors that I didn't particularly love on first read another shot, either with a different book of theirs or with a reread. For this, I'm starting with a reread of Weather by Jenny Offill. Last year, I read Department of Speculation, and it was probably my least favorite book of the year last year. And I read this back in, I have to sneeze. Actually, I read Weather back in 2020, I believe. I think this is like right before COVID. I think this book was published then. And I remember sort of liking it, but then similarly to Department of Speculation, having some problems with the fragmentary structure of it. Department of Speculation to me felt sort of like it was just drowning in its ideas rather than actually presenting a coherent narrative, and it was hard to follow. And I just think the fragmentation did not work there. But as of this morning, I am 29 pages into this one, and upon reread, I really like this so far. I like that we have a character that feels a little bit more developed than the narrator in Department of Speculation. We're following Lizzie, who works in the library of a university she used to attend as a grad student, and then she dropped out. And her mentor at the time was able to get her a job in the library, and she's also a mother and married. Her brother is a recovering addict. And we're seeing her in her day-to-day as she then starts working for her mentor, and she now has a podcast, the mentor, and she's answering questions that get fielded to her that are very existential and about sort of end times and religion. And so Lizzie's sort of thinking about her place in the world in terms of her sort of being a quote-unquote failure for herself and what she thought she was going to be doing, but then she's also a mother and married and trying to figure all that out. So I really like this so far, and I like the humor presented here. I think more so than in Department of Speculation, I think Jenny Offill really is leaning into the dark humor in this book that I think works well, particularly in the fragmentary structure here, because sort of like with the one-liner of it all, like trying to use play on words in the fragmentary structure here, I think it worked well. And so aside from Weather being my reread for this project, I wanted to try Catherine Lacey again. So I went to my library and got The Answers. Back in, again, I think this is 2020, I read Pew by her, which was a book that I was so excited for and seemed like everything that I was going to like love in a book. It seems sort of like Shirley Jackson-ish, and follow a young person who arrives in this very conservative religious town, and the person does not have a specified gender or race or age, I believe. I think it's just indicated that they are young, and it's narrated from the perspective of this character named Pew. And to me, the book was completely, in my recollection, it was very repetitive, and it seemed like the idea was a really interesting thought experiment to have a narrator who does not have certain signifiers to the reader, to then see how that plays in a very conservative and religious community, and how people start to imprint their own secrets and assumptions and stereotypes onto Pew as a character, and then us as the reader being in Pew's seat having to experience that. That sounded really amazing, but again, in terms of narrative, it was very flat and repetitive in terms of Pew having conversations or one-sided conversations with other people in the town, and they just start giving secrets to Pew, and Pew doesn't really have a response to them. So like as a narrator, Pew doesn't really offer anything to the narrative, which again, structurally, it sounds interesting and something that I would be interested in. But I remember liking her sentences, and I thought the idea for that novel was good. So I want to try another one of hers. And so I picked up this one. I know CJ really liked this book last year. And when I was telling her about doing this project, she was like, read The Answers, it slaps. So my understanding is this book follows a woman who is suffering from chronic pain in New York City. And she starts doing this like holistic treatment or like a new agey experimental treatment for her pain that ends up working. And then it's very expensive though. So she's like on Craigslist, I think, and she tries to find a job and ends up working for this wealthy and infamous actor named Kurt Skye. And her new job title is emotional girlfriend in his girlfriend experiment. So I guess he has a bunch of girlfriends and has hired a team of biotech researchers to solve the problem of how to build and maintain the perfect romantic relationship, casting himself as the experiment's only constant. And I guess the main character gets involved in this as the emotional girlfriend for him. And so I guess this book is like a balance of her dealing with her pain and trying to pay for it in New York City, and also getting involved in this sort of cult-y thing. It sounds really interesting and quite different from Pew, but also seems quite ambitious in what it's trying to do. So I'm curious to see what this is about. So I think I'm gonna read this one as the new read of an author that I didn't love the first time. And then if I get to it, I might just do those 2 books, because asking myself to like commit to 3 books in one video has never worked, and I don't know if it's going to work this time. But I also have Samantha Schweblin's Mouthful of Birds. This is her story collection, and I've read 2 of her books before, Fever Dream and Little Eyes, and both of them I felt very mid on. But they're both books that I thought would work well for me because they sort of play with literary horror in a sense. Fever Dream was more like ecological horror, and Little Eyes was more like tech horror, but I felt like narratively, I guess that's a through line here, I didn't love either of them. I think Fever Dream was quite fever dreamy, and it just didn't really work for me on that front in terms of me kind of coming away from it being like, okay, I don't know. I think it was sort of a novella, and so I'm wondering, in terms of her stories that are much shorter, like will that sort of rendering of like a weird moment, will that work better in a condensed form? I think that might be the case. But if I'm not in the mood for Samantha Schweblin, I'm thinking about reading an Ali Smith, maybe. This is the project. Also, Catherine Lacey has a book coming out in March that has a cool cover and sounds interesting, and I know a lot of people like her, so I hope I also like her. And then a maybe Samantha Schweblin as well. But this morning I am going to meet CJ for breakfast at the Coronado in Phoenix. Very happy that she moved to Yuma, because now we get to see each other much more often. So I will try to get some B-roll of that, keep reading weather, let you know what I think. But so far, so good. I'm very excited to see how this video turns out. Okay, bye. Okay, y'all, so there's moments like these where I'm like, okay, I don't know how I feel. Like there's a fragment here, like a standalone fragment that says, I buy a telescope because I want to see. I buy running shoes because I want to run. This block smells like garbage. Turn left for greener streets. Yes, better. I try to run all the way to the park, but these shoes don't work. Okay. The running shoes that you bought because you wanted to run, or you bought them because you need new shoes? Or, I don't know, man. We'll see. Try my hardest.
When's the last time you even vlogged?
Okay, hello. It's later in the day. I've gone to the gym. I went on the treadmill and read and listened to this while I was doing that as well. I will say this book definitely, I have like a quarter of the book left, so I'm going to finish this after I film this clip. But this book I think has a lot of promise, and I definitely like this book more than Department of Speculation. I just think its structure and some of its execution isn't for me per se, but I do think that her use of humor here and the ideas presented regarding climate change and reckoning with being a person now, I think those ideas are really interestingly portrayed through the fragmentary form, but I don't think that it always works, because sometimes there are, segments of fragments here where I'm just kind of not sure what the connective tissue is there that I'm supposed to be pulling from. And I know Jenny Offill's using this sort of humor or trying to have like a hidden depth to the meaning of what she's writing, but sometimes it just kind of comes across strangely. Like one example that I have here that makes me think that she is essentially requiring the reader to reread the book is the first paragraph of this book is a fragment that describes someone who is, I'll just read it. It says, "In the morning, the one who is mostly enlightened comes in. There are stages, and she is in the second to last, she thinks. This stage can be described only by a Japanese word. Bucket of black paint, it means." Then it jumps to a different fragment and says, "I spent some time pulling books for the doomed adjunct." So, like, that first fragment, it suggests that it's in the morning, and so you later realize that it's observational, and it's Lizzie partaking in meditation, essentially. It's Lizzie at a class, and she's observing someone, but that's not clear until later in the book when you put together the reference that she's making to that woman. And so I'm like, why would you introduce the book with that fragment? Like, I know it's supposed to place you in the head of the narrator here, meaning Lizzie, but it's so like disorienting, and it just doesn't really have a narrative hold on you when you're reading it. So like I get the sentiment and what she's doing, but it just doesn't completely work for me. Now in this book, Donald Trump has been elected, and a lot of the book is now really reckoning with this idea of living in the present and thinking about that, I guess. And so there's one really eerie passage here because it talks about how it was suggested that women of reproductive age are being urged to get IUDs because they can last 6 to 12 years and so might outlast the shuttering of the clinics. And in light of Roe v. Wade being overturned, that was really harrowing to read as this book was published in February 2020. So it's really interesting reading this post-COVID and thinking about how this was published right before COVID and thinking about just how present this book does feel. So yeah, I'm liking this more than I thought I would. Problems I have with it aren't too significant to the point that I want to DNF it. Like I do think it's interesting. I like the humor, but overall I'm feeling kind of mid on it as I expected to be. But yeah, I'll check in once I have final thoughts. Hello everyone, we're in Sedona off-roading. My partner Scott, this is Scott, he has a Jeep and he likes to off-road, so I went with him. I usually don't go, this is not usually my thing, but Sedona is very gorgeous. So yeah, I'll take more footage and then I'll check in on books later. Bye. Okay, hello everyone. We are back from our day trip to Sedona, in which we went off-roading. As I mentioned previously, Scott has a Jeep, and he likes to partake in some off-roading on occasion. I usually don't go with him because it's not really my thing, but I wanted to get out of Phoenix, escape the heat a little bit. It was like in the 80s in Sedona, but it was fun. But I wanted to check in on books and sort of wrap up the vlog here. And overall, I think this challenge was really fun and one of the most interesting and sort of illuminating things that I've done on this channel, I think. I usually don't set challenges for myself or set TBRs, and I'm really glad that I actually stuck to a theme here. And I have some interesting through lines that I found in doing this reread and new read, so let's just get into it. So first up, I finished Weather by Jenny Offill, and I will say for this book, I remain similarly mixed on Jenny Offill generally, but this one, I think upon reread, I liked aspects of this more than I remembered liking, and I definitely liked this more than Department of Speculation. All in all, I think this book, Weather compared to Department, has a more interesting and compelling main character. And the relationships that are at the center of this book, namely that with her husband and her brother, and with her previous mentor who she's now working with, I think all of those relationships are fleshed out pretty well given the fragmentary structure here. But I will say there are moments and sections in this book that just didn't really work for me on a humor level, and also I feel like some of the hidden meaning of what Jenny Offill is trying to get across sometimes does not work really well, like in the clip I previously put in which I kind of was left puzzled by some of the language or conclusions that Jenny Offill tries to get to in these fragments. I think just given that sort of form, there's not enough to sort of carry a strong narrative current through this. So I do think that these books are best consumed in 1 to 2 sittings. But I will say overall, it's just not my preference for a novel. But I do think the ideas here in terms of climate fiction and thinking about end times in a very stream of consciousness and fragmentary structure, given our internet brains, I think Jenny Offill is using that idea in an interesting way, but I don't think in execution it is for me as a reader. And now I've read this book twice and her other book, I think I can strongly say that I am quite mixed on her overall. I just think sometimes she's a little bit off, which is weird, and I'm not sure why that is, but it was interesting reading this now too, because on the back there are blurbs from Ben Lerner, Sheila Heti, Dana Spiotta. Those are 3 authors that I really love, and I didn't really know who they were at the time of reading this, and so it's just interesting going back and reading those blurbs. It'd be fun whenever Jenny Offill writes her next book. I think I'm going to check it out and just see what I think about it as a sort of tiebreaker, I guess, between her first 2 books or these 2 books. But I think the real star and interesting thing that happened to me in this vlog or over this week is that I found like a new favorite book this year, and it's The Answers by Catherine Lacey. As I mentioned, I read Pew about 2 years ago, did not love it. And I read this book and it's very different, but I will say, I think in Pew and Weather, the tie between these books that I think was hard for me as a reader 2 years ago to really get into was this idea of omission. So in Pew, we have omitted characteristics of our main character who's sort of just a voice that doesn't really tell you much about who they are. And in Weather, it's a fragmentary narrative, so it's not really a traditionally told story, and it's spliced, and it's just a little bit more challenging to sort of get your feet wet into it. But I think in this book, I feel like Catherine Lacey really gets into these questions of omission and thinking about human connection in this book in a way that is actually kind of more traditional and has more of a cohesive narrative, and it's quite propulsive even from the first page. It kind of reads like a horror novel from the start. It opens with Mary, our main character, who looks outside of her window and sees a woman staring up into her apartment, like trying to look for her. And it's very ominous and creepy. She hangs suspense over this entire book, which I thought was really well done. But what I love the most about this book is it's deeply philosophical and looking at these questions of love and human connection by looking at those things and trying to figure out, are there any answers available for the questions that we have as humans? And when we try to structure our lives or try to use scientific experiments to really understand these things that don't really seem to have answers in themselves, what does that in turn reveal about ourselves? So in this book, she ends up going on dates as a sort of girlfriend for this very, very successful actor. I kept thinking of like Taylor Swift for some reason in this book in terms of relating the actor to this person, just thinking about the sort of overexposure of it all and keeping it hidden. But he essentially starts this experiment in which he has a different girlfriend for different reasons. So he has an emotional girlfriend, a maternal girlfriend, a mundane girlfriend, one that always fights with him. And this book is split into 3 parts in which the first and third parts are told from Mary's perspective. In the second part, we jump around different perspectives, all in the third person, of these different girlfriends, of Kurt, the actor, and of Mary herself as well. I thought this book was really interesting in how it explores these different perspectives and trying to find those connections between the characters, and Catherine Lacey through just immaculate prose, trying to parse through these questions of how we try to find ways of structuring our lives or finding a way to love each other and what that means and why we search for it and why does it often fail when we do, and what is the true meaning that we're trying to find through finding love in another person, and can you find that within yourself given familial trauma, given the socio-political climate. Like, all these questions are sort of boiling in this book, and I think she's able to synthesize them in a way that is unputdownable, funny, dark, with a really strong character at the center here. And I kind of noticed that some of the things in Pew that I was considering upon reflection, I realized that Catherine Lacey asked these questions in a different way in this book that I thought was really interesting. And so overall, I loved this book so much. It is a new favorite of mine. I am so excited for her new book coming out in March of 2023. The publisher actually approved my request for a galley, so that should be coming soon. But I decided that I'm going to reread Pew now because I thought the answers was so strong. And this morning I read about 20 pages and I'm already obsessed with it and rethinking the way I was considering that book initially when I read it. And so overall, I think what I've learned from this challenge is that we often bring a lot ourselves to the books that we read. And I myself, as a mood reader, I think that really plays into my enjoyment of certain books or not. And I wonder if, like, the timing of this book, when I read it, it just wasn't for me, or I didn't really have these sort of questions in my head that now I often think about these things or look for in books, namely like deeply philosophical questions in books, being more comfortable with omission in books as well, sitting with books in a little bit more of a contemplative way than I was maybe 2 years ago when I was trying to just get my booktube content coming out and not really taking the time that I needed to sit with books as I do now and understanding my taste more, not inputting my own sort of expectations on books. Like, I think I expected Pew to be this very dark, like Shirley Jackson build up to like a dark, horrific ending, and it doesn't really do that in a way. So I'm excited now that I've read it once to go back and see what I think of it. But I'm gonna save my thoughts for my wrap up, and so I'm not going to put this in the vlog. But also, one thing that I'm noticing in these two books is her use of this idea of scapegoats. And so I was just reading the intro to, or the epigraph for Pew, and it is a quote from a story by Ursula K. Le Guin, which essentially is a story about this utopia, this town in which people are all happy, there's no problems in it. But I guess later they learn that the reason why the city is sustained by happiness is because one child is in poor condition and suffering to give the rest of the town that utopia. And this epigraph is a quote in which some of the people of the town leave and thinking about kind of where they're going and walking away from this utopia, giving them understanding that there is a scapegoat for this or someone to put all of the misery and harm on. And then, of course, I already read this book, so I know that this is also about people sort of imprinting their own biases and assumptions on the character of Pew here and thinking about how we sort of have this inherent bias or try to think about identity in a very constructed way, which I think is fun now to think about that upon reading the answers, because this book also, we follow Mary, who grows up in a very deeply religious household and thinking about how now she's in New York City and she doesn't really know much about the world given her upbringing and given that trauma. But I think this book does subvert the sort of trauma plot narrative that I've been discussing a lot on my channel this year. This centers Mary deeply in her present struggle and doesn't really raise a question of kind of what that is. It's deeply about Mary struggling with her present chronic pain and trying to think through these questions of connection while not really being too preoccupied with the mystery of her childhood. Like, there are moments where we learn about that, but it's not the core of this book. But it does sort of support the narrative as we learn it, as she's in this relationship in the present and trying to earn money and all of that. I think Catherine Lacey really subverts those cliches of a trauma narrative. And now reading this, I can see how Catherine Lacey, in her structuring of these novels, she uses this sort of act of omission or thinking about these deeply philosophical human questions in a way that doesn't really spoon feed you answers. And so it kind of reminds me of some of my favorite books this year, including those by Sheila Heti, Elif Batuman, these deeply, I guess, novel of ideas that I've seen that term thrown around, I guess, but I think Catherine Lacey is deeply in that vein of storytelling, which I just love so much. I think it gives rise to really lush and reflective and fun and brainy and humorous prose that I tend to really enjoy these days. So my conclusions are quite different from what I expected. So I think if you ever had a book that you really disliked, but you're kind of unsure why you did, I would highly recommend that you just go back and try it again to see what maybe those reasons were, and maybe you're just a different reader now or you're in the right place for the book. Overall, as I mentioned, I think we do, as readers, bring our own expectations and assumptions and our own mood to what we're reading at a given time, and that can all play into our enjoyment of them, which is why I've decided to sort of step away from like the 5-star rating system on Goodreads and just mark books as read, because my feelings kind of fluctuate on books from moment to moment. And I think us as readers, we often have that, and I don't think it's really reflective in a binary system like that. But anyways, yeah, I'm excited to read Pew and her new book once it arrives. I think it's coming like this week, so I'm going to just binge Catherine Lacey, I think, and I'll have more thoughts on that in my future wrap-up. If you'd like to see more vlogs, let me know what you want to see. I'm thinking of doing like a reread of my all-time favorite books to see if I still love them. So sort of like an inverse of this challenge. Let me know what you want to see. I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye.